The 12th of July 1942. Coastal sector near El Alamein, Egypt. Gunner Jack, shirt off, skin salted white, drops another brass case into the growing pile at his knee. It lands with a dull, hot clink. The air tastes like cordite and dust. Behind the shield, the 25-pounder sits low on its platform like a squat machine that's already decided it will outlast the day. No dramatic silhouette. No romance. Just a barrel, a breech, and men moving in a rhythm that's almost mechanical. A range, 9,800 yards, is called and confirmed. The layer's hand tightens on the wheel, the breech snaps shut. A lanyard jerks. The gun punches. The earth shudders, again. And again. 90 minutes later, the troop has fired 1,250 rounds. A reprisal shoot answered shot for shot against German artillery. The empty cases look like evidence at a crime scene. And the strangest part is this. For the gunners, the mystery isn't how the enemy survived. It's how the gun didn't break. By mid-1942, Australian soldiers were fighting a split war, 2 theatres, 2 climates, 2 sets of operational problems, yet one unifying demand: dependable fire support. In North Africa, Australian formations operated alongside the British 8th Army in conditions that punished equipment in a different way: heat that cooked lubricants, fine sand that found every bearing surface, and vast sightlines where artillery duels were measured in miles rather than meters. At El Alamein, Australian gunners were part of the grinding struggle to hold and then push back Axis forces threatening Egypt and the Suez lifeline. Artillery was not a supporting actor. It was the spine of the fight: registration, counter-battery work, defensive fire, and sudden stonks called down to break attacks before they reached the wire. At the same time, in the Southwest Pacific area, the tactical reality was the opposite: jungle, swamp, kunai grass, mountains, and tracks that collapsed into mud under a single vehicle. Australian infantry often fought where moving a full-sized field gun away from coastal plains and airstrips became a job for rope, sweat, and sheer stubbornness. That disconnect, between what the infantry needed and what could physically be moved, became lethal. And the enemy was not a passive target. Japanese forces constructed dense field fortifications, bunkers built from coconut logs and earth, camouflaged by vegetation that regrew almost as fast as shells could tear it away. The Battle of the Beachheads, Buna, Gunner, Sanananda, ran from the 19th of November 1942 to the 22nd of January 1943, and killed approximately 1,300 Australians, 1,000 Americans, and 6,000 Japanese. Those figures are not atmosphere. They are the bill for underestimating prepared defenses and overestimating easy solutions. Australia also already knew what a long siege did to men and material. At Tobruk in 1941, Australian casualties from the 8th of April to the 25th of October numbered 749 killed, 1,996 wounded, and 604 prisoners, with total divisional losses to mid-December higher still. When you live under shelling for months, you don't like artillery, you depend on it like you depend on water. So the context is simple and brutal. Australia needed a field gun that could deliver reliable, accurate, repeatable fire, fast, whether the ground was rock-hard desert or sucking swamp. And that's where the 25-pounder enters the story. Not as a glamorous superweapon, but as the system that made everything else possible. A field gun doesn't win wars by existing. It wins them by being there, on time, in the right place, firing the right ammunition, without complaint. Australian operations exposed 3 tactical problems that kept repeating. Mobility versus firepower. Heavier guns hit harder, but couldn't always be moved where the infantry actually fought. Sustained fire. Quick bursts matter, but so does the ability to keep firing without breakdown or loss of accuracy. Flexible trajectories. The Pacific demanded high-angle solutions into jungle defenses. The desert demanded flat trajectories, long reach, and rapid counter-battery shifts. Here's the reality in comparative form, because the gunner doesn't care about theory. British 18-pounder, legacy limited, modern flexibility and increasingly mismatched to interwar requirements. hence the push to replace it alongside the 4.5-inch howitzer with a single, more adaptable piece. American 75mm pack howitzer, requested for jungle, highly portable, but Australia's request was not immediately filled, and it didn't solve the need for a common ammunition and training system across field regiments. Source: Enemy advantage. Japanese mountain capability. Japanese forces used artillery that could be disassembled and manhandled or carried by pack animals, meaning they could bring guns into terrain where Allied pieces struggled to follow. Australian need, specific requirement: a gun that could deliver high-angle and direct fire, sustain 6 to 8 rounds per minute in trained hands, hit out to 13,400 yards, 12,253 meters, with he, and still be moved quickly, preferably by common tractors and trailers, with ammunition handled efficiently. Environmental factors made the gap worse. Desert sand destroyed tolerances, tropical humidity attacked metal and men, mud swallowed wheels, and vegetation broke observation, turning artillery into a problem of communication and adjustment rather than line of sight. And there's a final factor that rarely gets said out loud: morale. When infantry trust their guns, they move; when they don't, they hug the ground and die there. In Papua, the fighting at Bunaganasanananda became a brutal lesson in what happens when artillery can't be delivered in sufficient weight, at sufficient speed, against prepared fieldworks. The casualty counts in that campaign were the consequence of capability arriving late, in limited quantities, and under impossible logistical strain. Australia didn't just need a new weapon, it needed a reliable artillery ecosystem. The 25-pounder, particularly in Australian service, became that ecosystem. The 25-pounder's origin isn't a shed behind a house or a lone genius with a file. It's something more revealing about modern war, a weapon born from compromise, then refined by practice until it feels inevitable. The British requirement after the First World War was clear: replace two separate roles, the 18-pounder field gun and the 4.5-inch howitzer, with one piece that could do both jobs. High velocity and flat trajectory for direct work. Variable charges and elevation for howitzer work. One gun. One ammunition family. One training doctrine. Money slowed everything. So the earliest service guns were hybrids, rebored and adapted, pressed into use while true production matured. But by 1940, the standard pattern, the Ordnance QF 25-pounder Mk2 on carriage Mki, was entering service in quantity, and Commonwealth armies quickly learned what they had: a piece that could be set, fired, corrected, and shifted with a speed that made it feel like an extension of the commander's brain. Australia's story takes a decisive turn when domestic production comes online. Australia didn't just use the 25-pounder. It built it. 1,527 complete guns manufactured in Australia from May 1941, with carriages welded rather than riveted. That's not trivia. That's an industrial nation deciding it will not be strategically helpless. And then the jungle broke the rules. In New Guinea, the standard 25-pounder was successful in the abstract, but physically difficult to deploy away from the narrow corridors where vehicles could travel. So Australia did what it repeatedly did in the Pacific: adapt. In September 1942, Australia's Director of Artillery, Brigadier John O'Brien, proposed a jungle-optimized variant, something that could be broken down and moved by aircraft or light vehicles. Development began immediately. It was not leisurely. It was war. The work was carried out in Australia by the Army, the Ordnance Production Directorate, and Charles Ruwalt Party Limited, industrial cooperation driven by necessity. The breakthrough wasn't a single dramatic test shot. It was the moment the system proved it could turn design into metal fast enough to matter. By January 1943, an acceptable lightened gun existed. In August 1943, it began reaching units under the Jungle Division structure, one battery per field regiment. And it gained its own nickname, the Snort. Not elegant. Not official. Very Australian. So the origin story has two layers: the standard 25-pounder, built for a doctrine of fast, accurate, controlled fire, and the Australian answer to the jungle, proof that doctrine and industry could bend without breaking. Technical breakdown. Let's get detail-obsessed, because the 25-pounder is one of those weapons where the why is hidden in the measurements. The standard piece, QF 25-pounder Mk2 on carriage Mki. Start with the numbers. Caliber, 87.6 mm, 3.45 in. Mass, 1,633 kilograms, 3,600 pounds. Length, muzzle to towing I 4.6 meters, 15 feet 1 inch. Barrel length, 2.47 meters, 8 feet 1 inch, 28 calibers. Traverse, 4 degrees left and right on the carriage, but 360 degrees on the firing platform. Elevation, -5 degrees to +45 degrees, and up to 80 degrees with special arrangements. Rate of fire, 6 to 8 rounds per minute maximum. Maximum range, he 12,253 meters, 13,400 yards. Muzzle velocity, 198 to 532 meters per second, 650 to 1,750 feet per second, depending on charge. Crew, 6 men in standard detachment roles. Shell, 88 by 292 mm R, separate loading. Shell weight, 11.5 kilograms, 25 pounds, including fuse source. Now here's what those numbers mean in practice. Separate loading, quick firing reality. The 25-pounder loads in 2 steps, projectile first, then cartridge case. That cartridge case is not cosmetic. It provides obturation and speed. When the breech opens, the case is automatically released. That's part of what QF originally meant here. Quick handling, repeatable rhythm. Source. Variable charges, the gunner's range dial made physical. The normal cartridge carried 3 cloth charge bags, color-coded. Removing bags gives charge 1 or charge 2, keeping all gives charge 3. Then there's Super, a different cartridge entirely. This turns one gun into multiple guns, low-velocity lobbing fire when you need it, and longer-range flatter work when you don't. In 1943, an incremental charge, Super Plus, was introduced to increase muzzle velocity when firing armor-piercing shot with Super. That extra recoil required a practical engineering response, a muzzle brake. The gun was modified so it could deliver higher velocity direct fire without becoming unstable at low elevations. The platform, the hidden genius. If you only remember one mechanical feature, remember this: the circular firing platform. The platform transfers recoil into the ground and gives the gun a stable base. It also allows the carriage to rotate smoothly, making rapid traverse possible. In a direct fire emergency, anti-tank work, for example, that 360 degrees capability is the difference between we can't shift in time and we can. The detachment, a 6-man machine. The crew roles are defined because speed depends on choreography. Number 1, detachment commander. Number 2, operates breech, rams shell. Number 3, layer. Number 4, loader. Number 5 and number 6, ammunition handling and preparation, including fuse work source. This is why the gun can maintain 6 to 8 revolutions per minute without becoming chaos. Everyone has a task. Everyone stays inside the drill. Ammunition and effects. The standard high-explosive shell carried about 1.824 pounds, 0.827 kilograms, of explosive filling, TNT or amatol. It's not the heaviest field shell of the war, but the British and Commonwealth idea was suppression and responsiveness rather than one-shot demolition. And yes, Australia's gun lines could fire at an astonishing tempo. At Alamein, a single Australian troops reprisal shoot fired 1,250 rounds in 1.5 hours, a statistic that tells you as much about crew drill and ammunition handling as it does about metallurgy. The Australian jungle adaptation, QF 25-pounder short, contextual, but important. Australia also created the 25-pounder short for jungle mobility. Mass, 1,315 kilograms, 2,900 pounds. Produced, 1943 to 1944, 213 built. Maximum range, 11,500 yards, 10,500 meters, with supercharge, emergency use. Rate of fire, 3 to 4 revolutions per minute. That's the trade, less range, lower sustained rate, but far better mobility in terrain that otherwise denied field artillery. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We are building something here for people who actually care about the details. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. The 25-pounder's combat effectiveness isn't a single famous day. It's the fact that it shows up everywhere Australians fight, and the gun keeps doing its job. Vignette 1. Alamein. Heat, distance, and tempo. The 12th of July 1942, Alamein area. The Australian War Memorial caption is unusually specific, gunners firing at 9,800 yards, with a visible pile of empty shell cases, and the hard statement of comparison, German artillery fired 700 rounds in 1 hour. The Australians answered with 1,250 rounds in 1.5 hours. That is not spray and pray. That is a disciplined battery-level response in a counter-battery environment where sustained fire mattered. The 25-pounders separate loading ammunition, fast drill, and stable platform let crews keep the gun working at pace without tearing itself apart. And notice the implication, the gun isn't just accurate. It's reliable under volume. Vignette 2, Papua. When artillery arrives, morale changes. Fast forward to Papua. The Beachheads campaign becomes a story of brutal miscalculation corrected by improvisation. The Anzac Portal account describes the situation vividly. Supply lines attacked, small ships sunk, airstrips hacked out, and then, finally, guns arriving forward. The line that matters is simple. When guns reached the fronts on 23 to 24 November, a few rounds were fired to lift morale. Artillery doesn't just kill, it stabilizes. When infantry hear their own guns, they believe they are not alone. In the thick vegetation of Boona and Sanananda, observation was difficult, maps were imperfect, and ammunition supply limited. Yet the arrival of 25-pounders, moved by dangerous coastal runs and fragile air logistics, gave commanders an option besides frontal rifle assaults into bunkers. Even in accounts focused on infantry, the guns appear as a turning point, not a miracle, but a shift from helplessness to capability. Vignette 3. Industrial interchangeability, war as a manufacturing problem. One of the most striking facts about Australian 25-pounder production is not merely the number of guns. It's what an Australian official photograph caption bragged about in December 1941. Component parts were machined so precisely that a complete breech block could be assembled from components chosen at random from factories across the empire. That statement is essentially a weapons quality claim, interchangeability as battlefield reliability. That's combat effectiveness by other means. If your breech parts interchange, you can repair. If you can repair, you can keep guns in action. And if your guns stay in action, everything downstream, infantry, armor, supply, survives longer. Vignette 4, Korea, Commonwealth fire support as a single language. Jump again, this time to Korea, June 1951. An AWM image caption shows New Zealand 25-pounder, Mark II, guns giving artillery support to 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, during operations across the Imjin River. This matters because it shows the 25-pounder's secondary legacy, a shared Commonwealth artillery language, same gun, same drills, same ballistic expectations, same gunner culture. And in Korea, that shared system becomes part of a combined defense, exactly the kind of coalition warfare Australia would keep fighting. The Battle of Kapyong, 23 to 25 April 1951, is often remembered for infantry endurance, but the Anzac Portal account explicitly names supporting artillery, 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, behind the infantry positions. The numbers are stark, 2,800 UN troops facing 10,600 Chinese, Australian losses 32 killed, 50 plus wounded, 3 prisoners, and Chinese losses described as over 2,000. Artillery doesn't replace infantry. It makes infantry survivable. So what did gunners actually value? They valued the things that don't trend on posters. Predictable laying and correction. Rapid fire without mechanical drama. An ammunition system that scaled. And a platform that let the gun swing where it needed to. The 25-pounder earned its workhorse reputation by doing the unglamorous work at speed. And in war, unglamorous is often the difference between being overrun and holding. The 25-pounder's strategic impact in Australian service can be summarised in one phrase. It standardised Australian firepower. Because the gun was both a howitzer and a field gun in one system, it reduced the organisational friction of mixed artillery parks. It allowed Australian units to train a consistent drill, plan fires with predictable ballistic envelopes, and, crucially, sustain operations with a common ammunition family that could be manufactured across the Commonwealth industrial base. It also reinforced a particular style of warfare, rapid response and suppressive control. The 25-pounder was designed for neutralisation, fast, accurate, repeatable fire, rather than one-shot destruction. That aligns with the artillery control system reputation that later, in Northwest Europe, reportedly made German soldiers believe the British had deployed an automatic gun, because the responsiveness felt unnatural. For Australia, the deeper impact was industrial and doctrinal. Industrial, producing 1,527 guns locally meant the army was no longer hostage to overseas supply shocks. Doctrinal, the gun's presence enabled artillery to become a reliable, planned element of Australian operations, rather than an occasional luxury limited by availability. Coalition leverage. In Korea, the 25-pounder became a common Commonwealth language, visible in New Zealand guns supporting Australian infantry. Enemy response? In the Pacific, Japanese countermeasures tended to focus on concealment, bunker depth, and infiltration raids to locate or silence guns. In the desert, the response was classic counter-battery and maneuver. The 25-pounder did not remove the enemy's vote, but it made that vote more expensive. And psychologically, artillery does something special. It makes the enemy feel watched even when you can't see him. When fire arrives quickly, repeatedly, and accurately, the battlefield feels smaller. That changes how both sides move. The 25-pounder didn't win wars alone, but it made Australian infantry far harder to kill. Production and service life. Australia didn't just field the 25-pounder, it industrialised it. An Australian War Memorial photograph from c. December 1941 shows large numbers rolling off assembly lines in Melbourne, emphasising precision machining and interchangeability of components, even down to breech blocks assembled from mixed factory parts. That's a production culture aimed at wartime repairability and scale. In total, Australia manufactured 1,527 complete guns from May 1941, and worldwide production exceeded 13,000. Australia's carriages were welded rather than riveted, an adaptation in manufacturing technique that reflected local industrial practice and wartime urgency. Service life in Australia extended well beyond 1945. The 25-pounder remained the standard gun in Australian field artillery regiments until it was replaced in the early 1960s by the American-built M2A2 105mm howitzer, and it lingered in reserve service until 1975 before final withdrawal. And there's a post-war Australian footnote that proves the gun's adaptability. Yaramba, an Australian self-propelled conversion mounting the 25-pounder on an American tank hull, converted in Bendigo between 1950 and 1952, then withdrawn by 1957. It remains the only self-propelled artillery introduced into the Australian Army to that date. Surviving examples are common in Australia, not because the gun is forgotten, but because it became a memorial object, outside RSLs, in parks, and in museums, including the Australian War Memorial Collection. Collector value varies wildly by legality, demilitarization, and completeness. Even in enthusiast circles, valuation debates exist, which tells you the weapon still has cultural gravity. The 25-pounder's legacy isn't a single copied mechanism. It's a lesson in what a field gun must be: reliable, flexible, and embedded in a doctrine that can exploit it. Mechanically, it demonstrated the power of an integrated system: separate loading ammunition with variable charges, a stable firing platform enabling rapid traverse, and a crew drill structured for speed and control. Those ideas echo across later artillery thinking, even as calibers standardized upward to 105 mm. In Australian history, the gun is also proof of industrial maturity under pressure. Building 1,527 guns locally during wartime is not merely production, it's sovereignty expressed in steel. And the Australian jungle variant, the 25-pounder short, is a separate legacy: adaptation to geography as doctrine. Australia didn't accept that standard meant good enough. It cut the gun down, redesigned the carriage, and traded performance for mobility because the terrain demanded it. That mindset, modify, localize, solve, became a defining trait of Australian operations in the Pacific. Modern analysts tend to praise the 25-pounder because it represents something rare: a weapon that did not chase perfection. It chased function. And it achieved a balance that made gunners trust it for decades. If you want to understand why old artillerymen still speak about it like a colleague rather than a machine, watch it fired: the drill, the rhythm, the calm violence of a practice detachment. 3.45 inches of bore, a circular platform, a brass case that drops free. This was the gun that kept firing when the desert tried to jam it with sand. This was the gun that answered enemy batteries with disciplined, measured punishment. This was the gun that let Australian infantry move because they knew fire would follow. The enemy had bunkers, mountains, and miles of empty space, but the gunners had a workhorse: repeatable, patient, exact. Back at El Alamein, the cases piled up like proof, not of noise, of endurance. The 25-pounder wasn't the loudest thing on the battlefield, it was the most dependable.